lifelong love of Dickens, reading Dickens over and over again, and finally thinking, I'm wasting my life. There are other things to read, what are you doing? But evidently things sunk in. And one of the characters in Dickens' Bleak House stuck in my mind, Inspector Bucket. And Inspector Bucket sort of magically appears and disappears and reappears throughout Bleak House. He's sort of I would say morally ambiguous character. I don't always approve of him. And yet he's warm and affable, and sometimes uses that as a trap for the bad guy. I thought, wouldn't it be great to write something with Mr. Bucket as the lead instead of the supporting character? But the story that grew in my mind had real historical characters in it, and I didn't want to mix a fictional one with them, and especially a character that wasn't my creation. Then I learned that Charles Dickens had a model for his Inspector Bucket. It was a real-life London policeman named Charles Field. And I thought, okay, that's free game for me now. To make my version of Charles Field, and it became Inspector Charles Field, my Mr. Bucket. The Darwin Affair involved historical characters and my fictional ones, and I kept as close to the history as I could and just squeezed my fiction into it. And an awful, awful villain in the Darwin Affair, and I hope I've come up with another one in the Nightingale Affair. People question, where do these despicable characters come from? Look, I don't have any idea. I'm going to read just the first chapter here of the Nightingale Affair. Yeah, when I was researching the Darwin Affair, I took the advice of my friend Terry Kilburn and read a book called Eminent Victorians by Lytton Strachey. And one of the biographies, one of the essays, was about a woman named Florence Nightingale. Now, I only had vague notions of who Florence Nightingale was, and the lady with the lamp and all that. And Strachey suggests that that wasn't the true picture or the only picture or the whole picture. He said, a lady, kindly, gentle nurse to the wounded soldiers in Turkey during the Crimean War, was more comfortable to live with than the actual Florence Nightingale, who was truly a pioneer in a hostile male environment, but also, well, Strachey says, possessed of a demon. He says, demons are possessed people are more interesting than ladies. So I came to know and to love Florence Nightingale. Oh, what an amazing person. And I think I would take care to stay on her right side. So the Nightingale, I tried to fit her into the Darwin Affair, but she was just too big. She was too interesting, and the dates didn't quite fit. So she got her own book. Part 1, Rome, 1851. In his youth, he had been wealthy and acclaimed. His name was known throughout the continent. His devotees queuing for hours to hear him sing. He was a sought-after society guest. Heads of state sent their compliments. Unlike many of his kind, Massimo Ignazio Flammiev moved with precision and grace. His chest, the chest that held his magnificent lungs, was broad and manly, and his face, when he was young, had been that of an angel. He was articulate and well-spoken, conversant in 5 languages. Women flocked to him. well-born ladies, titled ladies. Despite his condition, or perhaps because of it, he had been able to bring those he selected for clandestine trysts to unparalleled heights of ecstasy. All that was long over. True, at the invitation of the Pope himself, Gregory XVI, Massimo had joined and was still a member of the Sistine Chapel choir. But the pay was insulting, the repertoire stultifying, and the small boys annoying. Invitations diminished, dwindled, and finally stopped altogether. Women, titled or otherwise, no longer pursued him. He walked the streets of Rome unrecognized. He missed the recognition bitterly, but he did not miss the women. He had turned against them. It all had happened so gradually he hadn't realized his danger. Even before his era, female singers had been allowed to perform on stages here and there, of course, but according to Massimo, these were loose women, obviously. Then there were more and more of them. It was hard to believe, but eventually they became more popular than Massimo and his kind. In a matter of years, they had taken his roles, every one of them, despite the undeniable inferiority of their voices. All that he had achieved, all that he had given up, and all that had been taken from him, including his testes, had been for naught. Mother said it was our path to riches and fame, and she was proven right. Never mind my tears at the time. She was a wizard with needle and thread, was Mother. No, women were not his friends. There were two of them now, English girls, already seated when he entered his box at Teatro Argentina. They looked and quickly looked away again as he folded his frame onto the petite gilt chair and set his bag at his feet. A new work from Verdi had appeared. It opened here the week before, after its premiere in Venice. Now Massimo would see it for the third time. Teresa Brambilla was singing, and it gave Massimo pleasure to sneer. The story of the opera, in his opinion, was vulgar. So was the leading lady, who played a character called Gilda, daughter of the Duke's corrupt court jester Rigoletto. The Duke, too, was corrupt, as were the noblemen. Everyone here, in fact, was corrupt, or, in Gilda's case, imbecile. Oh yes, we're to believe she never leaves the house except to go to church. Ha! Brambilla looks like a whore after a busy night. The music, though, was irresistible to him. It was, after all, the great Verdi. Massimo adjusted his fine silk cloak about his shoulders and took his embroidery from its bag. The women in the box looked again. Massimo stared them into blushing submission. He was not about to allow them any nonsense from the likes of them to mar his little pleasures. The gas lights dimmed, the overture began, and the great red drape rose majestically. It was during Gilda's first act aria that everything went wrong. He became aware that the English girls were scowling, that one of them was snapping her fingers at him. Others around him were hissing. Had he been singing without realizing it? Had he committed the aria to memory? Was he making a scene? Oh dear, I suppose I was. A simple melody, really, caro nome. Well, at least now it should be clear to all whose is the superior voice. A uniformed porter appeared and addressed the angry young Englishwomen. Perdonino, signore, il teatro chiede viene per il ristoro. The man gestured, and two other porters materialized at Massimo's side. They were telling him in whispers that he must leave. It was a nightmare. It couldn't be happening. They were actually touching him, lifting him up and propelling him to the exit. An outrage. The great Massimo Famiglia ejected. He strode at a great pace, unseeing through the dark streets, his rage uncooled by the chill, damp air, a forgotten man, spurned by the world. He knew from experience he should calm himself. He knew his weaknesses and knew he could not afford to make another mistake. His superiors had told him so. His superiors had overlooked his fits of rage for the last time. He stopped in his tracks, set down his embroidery bag, and took deep breaths. He was trembling. Tears stood in his eyes. There, across the piazza, beyond the elephant and the obelisk, was the Basilica de Santa Maria sopra Minerva. He reslung his bag over his shoulder and crossed the square. He would pray to the Holy Mother. He would implore her to purge him of his thoughts. The cold, dank darkness of the empty church was a comfort. He hurried to the nearest shrine, lit by a half-dozen guttering candles. He dropped to his knees and looked up into the Virgin's face imploringly. But her eyes were not gentle. They were fierce. They belonged not to Santa Maria, but to one of the young English women at the opera house, the finger snapper, judgmental, unforgiving, full of scorn. He hid his face and began to sing. Caro nome teo mio cor festi primo palpitar, the delizie dell'amor. The broom hit him between his shoulder blades and he fell forward. You can't come in here and sing. He rolled over and found an elderly nun staring down at him, shaking her broom in his face. No, he would not touch her. He would be strong. He would not defile this holy place, not with the Holy Mother watching him with implacable eyes. But then somehow the nun was on the floor, and he was standing outside on the basilica steps, clutching his bag to his chest and panting. The girl crossing the piazza was perhaps 20 years old. She had the bored slouch of a veteran, whatever her age. She was dark, with tightly curled black locks peeking out from a shapeless bonnet. Her cloak was threadbare. She glanced up at the man on the church steps and distractedly opened the left side of her garment to offer a glimpse of her well-shaped bodice, and then pulled it tight again as she passed. Stop, he said. How much? Depends. He steered her through the streets at a brisk pace in the general direction of the river, talking to her about embroidery. A pair of schoolboys discovered the body in the Tiber the next morning. Details of the crime were published in the late editions that afternoon. Certain officials at the Vatican noted them with dismay. They did not report their suspicions to the authorities. They merely dismissed Massimo quietly and sent him packing. Suddenly homeless and without an income, the castrato eventually left Rome, on foot most likely. It is thought that he spent some months at Rimini, mending sailcloth for fishing vessels. There was a rumor of him at Marseille. Eventually, though, he disappeared from record altogether. And we're off. Don't jump to any conclusions. Anyway, if questions occur to people, it's not obligatory. I'm 5'6". That's an exaggeration. Well, I'm thrilled to see you all here. And hey, Fred.
You're obviously a wonderful fiction writer, but you've done a lot of historical research. So I wonder how important it is to you when you're crafting these novels to say something at least interesting and maybe important about the history that's in the background of your
it's very important, and I strive to get the history right, although I know that I make mistakes, as has been pointed out to me. An old friend from Oxford actually flew to New York for the first reading, a historian and archaeologist, mainly to count up my historical errors. But, you know, I chose Darwin for a reason. The war which launched against Darwin continues today. The war that Nightingale signed up for is still going on today. So yeah, my prime interest is entertainment, but it has to be something that has some meaning to me and historically some, you know, some weight. If I'm able, I'll write a third novel called The Dickens Affair. We'll see. Anyway, yeah. Anybody else? Anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you write out of sequence at all? Do you get ideas and see a scene and think, well, that, I can arrive there at some point, or do you journey through it in order?
I pretty much do the latter. I don't have an outline. I don't know where I'm going when I begin. I don't recommend it. And many wonderful writers, you know, don't work that way, of course. And it takes so long that way. I'm discovering the story one page after another. Of course I have ideas of what's coming down the road, or the general overarching.
But you don't tend to get an idea of a scene maybe that's chapter 14 and think, oh,
I don't.
yeah,
I
interesting.
don't have an idea in my head. You know, I don't have a plan when I get up in the morning. My plan comes in my fingers when I'm typing. So,
He basically answered it. I was gonna ask if you wrote linearly or if you jumped around. but
oh
you-
yeah,
he's
no,
answered.
it's linear, that I've said, and it's not really true, but writing a novel for me is like reading one very slowly. It's, yeah.
So he's saying that, do you have any idea how it's going to end?
Yeah, I think so. This one I didn't. This one I didn't. My villain in Darwin Affair had a house, and I thought it probably was going to end in this house in a conflagration. But I didn't know what I was going to do with this guy until I discovered a character from British history, a duke, who I used to befriend my villain. But he used his money to dig tunnels and dig tunnels. He built ballrooms underneath the ground that were, of course, there was no balls ever held there. He had a carriage that would travel underground up and deliver him unseen onto the train if he had to go into London. So I used that peculiarity to create a character that led me to how this book would end. No, you're not going to hear it. Yeah.
Can you give some more information just about how Florence Nightingale plays in without,
Yeah. She was very wealthy and of a very high up family in society. For her to, well, okay, there were no nurses who were respectable, female ones. The males were nurses, and those females who were nurses were thought of as tramps and drunkards. And Dickens himself created one hell of a nurse in Mrs. Sarah Gump. You wouldn't want her taking care of you, but it was a delight to read her about,
Is that also part of Bleak House?
no, I don't think it's that novel, I can't remember which one it is, but
Okay.
she is drunk and kind of awful person, but we laugh at her. Where did we begin with it? It was
Florence Nightingale.
Florence Nightingale. So it was unheard of for a woman of her status to have a job. She was to get married to a respectable, appropriate match of equal wealth and live happily ever after. From early childhood, she had this passion to be a nurse, to take care of creatures. She began with, dogs and cats in the town, and her sister's dolls would break their legs and she would mend them. You imagine young Florence. She was a demon. And then she grew up and she was not doing what she was supposed to do, and it split the family apart. It was devastating to her mother. She could not conceive of this. But they loved their daughter, and they allowed her to study nursing in Germany for a year in a religious order that women were the nurses. And that was supposed to get it out of her system, and it didn't. So she became a matron of a home for retired nannies and governesses. This was at least maybe sort of semi-respectable. But then the Crimean War broke out, and for the first time in history, reporters were on the front and had the ability to send home dispatches to London almost, for the time, instantaneously. The telegraph had been invented, and even if it, just to have a reporter at the front was unheard of. So what came back, they had cheered the troops that they marched off to war, and what came back was reports of this terribly derelict hospital that they had commandeered, the British had commandeered, and the men were dying of sickness as well as injuries from war. In fact, it was possibly as dangerous to go into this hospital in Scutari, Turkey, as it was to be on the battlefield. So she wrote a letter to her good friend, the Secretary at War. She knew everybody. He wrote a letter to her simultaneously, and the two letters crossed in the mail. He wondered if she could take some nurses and go to the Crimean. She wanted the same thing. So she sailed out with 38 nurses into the unknown and found worse than could be imagined. The dead lying with the living, filthy, 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 no linen for the beds. Soldiers were regarded as scum, British soldiers, unless they were officers. And she did an amazing job quickly of beginning to turn that hospital around. And so, of course, the reporters reported on that, which did not make the men happy. So you had the medical brass and the military brass, all entirely male world, and this woman, who had no business there in a man's world, was hated. And they did everything they could to sabotage her work. That just astonished me, the lengths to which they actually went historically. So I just put a fictional person in the midst and set him loose. It takes place, though, that's the setup. 12 years later, in London, murders of a similar nature crop up, and Inspector Field, who by now has been fired from the Metropolitan Police, is he's a detective, and he involves himself, and then his family is involved in a threatening way.
So that's about 1860?
that's about 1855, but 1854 was when the war was on and Nightingale went out, and 12 years later, what is that?
66.
Thank you. How much is it? I can't do math. Anyway, yeah,
Two questions.
yes.
Were some of Nightingale's nurses historically murdered?
No,
Okay,
and in my book, none of them is murdered.
okay.
But
And,
if you're a woman, a British woman in the Crimean in that town, don't wear a Nightingale cape or a cap. Second question?
who's your reader in your mind while you're writing?
Me.
Who better?
Yes.
You've spoken how you do so much research into the people, and yet you describe in such great detail the architecture and the locations, like the elephant and the obelisk in the square. I'm curious, do you do research into the locations as well when you're speaking of these places that people can still go see?
Yes, and fortunately I'd been to Rome and knew this piazza where the Church of Minerva was, and the outside is an obelisk with an elephant sitting on top. I don't know why, but yeah, it's nice to have a detail like that. I was intending to go to Istanbul to do research because geography is so important, and then COVID hit and I couldn't go anywhere. So that, it's made up. I do my best to get the actual, I found photographs of Scutari, Turkey, not many, but one or two, and then photographs of the battlefield, you know, and that hospital. There are a number of photographs of that. But yeah, if you know the geography, it just is a great help to making stuff up. Should we, how are we doing, Rachel, for time?
We can keep going, or we can do a couple more questions.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Kim.
Any ideas, anything you can share with us about the new, that you're thinking about, the Dickens book?
Oh, the Dickens book. Well, I've got a chapter roughed out. Dickens had an actual relationship with Charles Field and called upon him from time to time for help, and also also butted heads. But in this fiction, Dickens would be threatened by a person who had the ability to take down his reputation, because Dickens, after doing much, much good for society and for women in particular, took a young girlfriend and kicked his wife out and treated her badly. So that's all that's remembered of Dickens. If anybody knows about him, they remember how bad he treated his wife, but they don't know about the earlier part of his life when he created a home for prostitutes, and which is unheard of, and where they could get out of the streets, and his solution was to put them on ships and send them to the New World to start over. You don't have a past. You'll meet a man who will fall in love with you, and he did it for 10, 12 years until he fell in love with the girl. Kind of screwed the pooch. Well, let's go sign some books and chat in the front.